Mediopolis, Chapter 14. So that's all about me then, said the mother, having finished her coffee now, sitting back on the chair, feeling that she'd said a lot and had rushed through so much of her life, without even asking Lucy any questions herself yet. Wasn't she here also for an interview? Didn't it work both ways? Still, she wanted to give a full explanation of herself and what the job she was asking her to do required. Yet young Lucy was there full of questions still, like a curious tourist, really, asking about a foreign world, or a foreign part of the world, perhaps. Didn't you give a name before he danced, though? Surely, went on Lucy, looking back to the picture of young Danny Dancer. How could I, if I didn't know what he did then? Asked the mother. I could hardly call him the angry, crying, strange child, could I? Asked the mother, confused. Well, you could just call him anything, said Lucy, confused herself. Well, perhaps that's how some people do things. Yes, I had many nice names for him, but only I used them. I didn't share those with the world or anything. He wasn't on any show with the world or anything then. We can only name a person for what they do in the world, so he didn't really need a name until he was older, until he started seeing the world, or the world started seeing him. That's when he needed a real name, began the mother. I had private names for him, she confided, but they weren't really names I'd share with the public, she said. It's just the custom that we have. Everyone's different. We don't give young children a social, public name, not until they're old enough to appear in the public themselves, explained the mother. And that was her reasoning for it. We have private names, but those just remain in private for just the private family, really, she explained. Explaining all this to Lucy, who really wasn't sure about it. It's just the custom that no one gives younger children a name. That's what my family did, said the mother. Not until they get old enough to know who they are. Then we can know more about what they are and name them after that, said the mother, reasoning to her logic. When they get to know themselves well enough, then the world has a chance to get to know them a little too. And then we can name them for what they are and not just some, arbitrary name that's just made up. I had my own names for the children, yes, but those are my personal names. They're worldly names, public names. Those are the names that they choose when they're older, explained the mother. Explaining that there was a difference between the show names that Lucy and the other childminders visiting and all the other visitors would be using for the children, as opposed to the personal names that she alone would be using for her own children. People earn their names, on the actual shows. The names themselves can be earned. They're acquired, just through time and effort, through studying, through learning, through working. That's how people earn their names in the show world. And sometimes you have to give up name and change the names. If the name gets stigmatized or falls into disrepute, or something else happens with the name. Often people have to choose and change the names, but you can't just choose any old show name. You have to choose something people feel are suited towards you, said the mother, as if trying to explain it now to Lucy. I see, but is Danny just short for dancer then? Danny Dancer? Because it sounds similar. Well, it just had a nice sound to it. That's why Mum called me it. That's why the other friends and the other family called me it. And I suppose the family shows, when I went on to the dancing shows, the name stuck. So, yes, it just had a nice sound to it, really. It was a theatrical, nice sound. And I just couldn't escape it, really. As the years went on, even strangers knew me as that. Strangers had seen me as that. And people on the bus stops were saying, Danny Dancer, even though, I'd never met them before. It's just what people knew me as, really. It does have a nice sound to it, I suppose, said Lucy, not wanting to speak badly of it. But it was just a show name. Obviously, I had a personal name with my parents as well, said the mother, still not wanting to confide what the personal name was, so it seemed, though, or not seeing it as necessary. So it's just a show name for the dance shows, really, said the mother. So I wouldn't be confused for the other dancers. They've all got their show names. Because I didn't know what else I could be, really. And I never thought I could escape the name once it had stuck and once it had become popular, explained the mother. Feeling it was too hard then to adapt and choose a new show name, since the old one was so popular and renowned at that point. I don't know what else to do, really. But it's a nice enough name, I suppose. But the children know me by other personal names, and friends do too, said the mother, but still having not yet revealed what those names perhaps were. I just didn't know what else I could be. So, yes, I've stuck with Danny Dancer as the show name for other show auditions that I might go on. It's just easier that way. And even to show clients doing the show care, still I'm Danny there, even though I don't Danny dance with them, said the mother now with a little smile as she explained the story. As at home, she just didn't get called Dancer. She wasn't Danny Dancer. But I'm still Danny to visitors at the family show, though, even if the family don't call me it, explained the mother. Well, I've seen it now. I've seen your dances, and yes, I can see why the name stuck, because it's a great dance, said Lucy, wanting to give a compliment to the mother, who she felt a little sorry for, having to give so much of a story to her. Then I was Mother Dancer. Well, that's what I was called in one of the shows, where the children were on the show as a family dance show. So I was one of the mother dancers during the family dance shows. Also explained the mother, going on now. I told you I did some home comforting work a while back as well. So I did comfort dancing shows, all sorts of different things. But I was always Danny Dancer on that. So that's easy just to know me as that. I had these 3 names, though, for a long time. Now Lucy was a little confused, as if those weren't all the different names that she'd had. Well, there was Kerry Dancer. Kerry short for caring, because I went into the care shows, and I was then more known for the care shows than the dance shows. So I was Kerry Dancer, but just to some of the clients. Some of the other clients just still knew me as Danny Dancer. So I was Kerry Dancer to some, Comfort Dancer to others. Then, of course, there was Mother Dancer, just from the family dance shows. And I stuck with Danny Dancer to those that already knew me as that. You're welcome to call me that, but I am also known as Carey Dancer, Comfort, and also Mother, just to some of the other children, not my own, of course, the other children that were on the family dance shows. You'll meet some of them if they visit, friends of the children, of course, explained the mother, trying to now explain all her different names. Well, I'm happy to call you anything you feel comfortable with, said Lucy, and the mother laughed a little at that. Well, call me Comfort if you please. That's just what most of the clients call me, but I'm mostly known just as, well, Carey sometimes at home, but usually as Danny. Either. Danny, Carey, either. Call me Comfort if you want to, though, but that really is just what a few of the clients, some of the older clients that I visit, call me. Lucy nodded along, a little embarrassed at her mistake, her faux pas. Either. I honestly can call you Carey, or if you prefer Danny. I didn't take dance so seriously back then, years ago, before the caring, not to begin with. So it just wasn't something I was known as. So I don't mind either. Whatever you're comfortable with, Carey Dancer, she said, finishing up her story. That's the name that a lot of the visitors use. But at home, just Danny will be okay, clarified the mother, not wanting Lucy to have to make a decision when she perhaps didn't know her that well yet, although she'd only known her from watching a few of the dancing videos. There were only a few. Then there are the others in the house. I've mentioned old Curtains upstairs. Well, he's not known as that anymore. Mr. Porter, he formerly goes as more now. Old Curtains lives up in the guest room, one of the wings of the house. You won't have to visit there for work, though. You're welcome to visit, if you felt the need to. He still calls himself some pretentious name, something like Seeker or Seeky. Seeky, that was it. Seeky Porter, but he was known as Mr. Porter to the other children, because that's, as a client name, what he was known as when they watched the family visits. So he's generally known as Mr. Porter to some of them, but he goes by different names, tried to explain the mother, looking over to the door again, expecting him to gallop into the room, as he sometimes did unexpectedly. He's a friend of your family's, I guess, or something, asked Lucy. Oh, he's like a grandfather figure, really, elder father. I mentioned him earlier, I think. Well, we adopted each other. He adopted us, and I him, or we him. The family adopted him because he'd been living on his own so long, on a lonely show. Rating slumbered and gone, and been like that for a long time. So he'd been looking for a new show to adopt. Saw the family show. I'd introduced it to him. A few months through our visits, he got to know some of the older children to talk to through the video shows, and talked to a few other some of the visiting family. So he met one of the aunts through a visiting show, and met me lots of times when I did the show caring, doing the show visits with him. So I brought him in from the Lonely Show just to do a trial visit, staying in one of the wings upstairs. There's a few other empty guest rooms he stays next to that he looks after. And there's a couple of the small pets that he's adopted of the children. He mostly just looks after them, doing a little cleaning and cleaning up after them, really. Not much more than that. He joins us for the family show dinners sometimes, and a very occasional family show chats. Not that often. And you wouldn't be expected to know him or work him or to be around him, to visit him, nothing like that. But I only mention him just because you might get a chance, you might happen to meet him. You might chance to meet him in the hallways, because his room is on the floor of the guest wing that is kind of just up from where you are, if you decide to stay. So there's the guest rooms for all of the visiting childminders. You'll be staying in one of those rooms, and the other visitor guest rooms are just further up the same corridor. It's on the same floor of the same corridor, but I'll show you all that later during the tour. So you might get a chance to meet the adopted elder father. He's the current one. The other ones left a while ago, but they might be returning to the empty rooms at other times. But I'll tell you if and when they do, said the mother, now looking down to a scrolling digital list on the machine in front of her that was projecting onto a small object placed on the table, so that she could see the different list of those visitors that were programmed in during the next few days and weeks. Those that any child-minding visitor that might take on the work would be likely to meet. Why did you call him Mr. Curtains, sorry, if he's Mr. Porter? Oh, that was the name before, answered the mother. He had an earlier name from an earlier profession. But he doesn't go by either, really. Just the last profession, even though he's retired from that too, explained the mother. I'll call him anything. If you happen to meet him, you can ask him. Tells different people different names, depending on how old they are or who they are, I guess, said the mother. But I think he gives the adults perhaps Mr. Curtains, just because they perhaps knew him as that from before. They may have older memories. Some of the older children, they only know him really as Mr. Porter, really, because that's what he was in his more recent work, explained the mother, trying to clarify the name confusions. But anyway, if you do get a chance, he'll introduce himself to you anyway. I just happened to mention it because you probably will meet him, on the visits to the lounge, to the dining table, the bathrooms, and also other restrooms. He's often in the restrooms, the lounge areas, reading, resting, doing various studying, whatever he does, said the mother, now looking over, glancing through the open plan lounge, where beyond the room that they were in was a connecting room, a lounge area, strewn with lots of chairs placed around, and long stretches of bookshelves that were all lined with lots of books and ornaments, with resting chairs placed in between them, glancing over to the long-distance space beyond, as if imagining her time sitting there and talking with the older man. And you call him Mr. Porter yourself, though? Well, I didn't like to call him Seeker or anything. Yes, Mr. Porter is what I knew him as. And old Curtains too, depending on what kind of mood he's in or how he is. Either. He doesn't mind either, really, said the mother, brushing it away, as if irrelevant. Well, I shouldn't call him Old Curtains or anything like that. He doesn't really have anything to do with that, and I don't think he likes to be connected with that in any way. He used to work with curtains. Curtains on Wheels. Loved his curtains years ago. Curtaining shows for years. Retired curtainer now. And retired porter. Has a lot of long stories about all of the curtaining. All of it. So he's never ending going on about it still. So that's why he's probably still known as that to some of them. If he catches you and goes on about it, don't let him go off on one of his long tangents, rambling on at you, warned the mother to Lucy, looking over to her confidently now, and placing the empty cup back alongside the tea's maid on the stand to one side of the lounge. Then she was getting up and gesturing to Lucy to stand up, leading Lucy up towards the hallway towards the long staircase area, towards the many corridors upstairs. The staircase wound round lots of times, going round and round in spiralic circles, where it went round up to one floor and another floor. Staring upwards, Lucy and the mother at the bottom of the staircase, staring far up, were unable to see how high the stairwell spiraled around. It seemed to go on and up for a long way, but it was unsure how far and how many floors up it went. They began walking up the rounded staircase, going up together, the mother leading a step ahead. I guess he's been looking for more new work. Doesn't know what to do anymore. Well, he's retired, can't do the former professions, explained the mother, rushing in on her narrative still. Why advertise that to the world, though? I don't know. I guess he's here still looking for what else to do and helping out in small ways. I help him out a little bit with the medication and some of the food preparation. The older children do some of that too, explained the mother, explaining the reasoning of why the older man had been brought to live in a room in one of the wings of the family house. There was a distant visitor wing of that house. So you call him Mr. Porter then, because he seems to have many names? Laughed Lucy, still unsure about why she was mentioning him so much. Well, around the children, yes, I will call him that. Just if I'm around the children. Or sometimes they will call him Grumpy, because he's one of the grumpier grandparents, explained the mother. Sometimes grumpy, but I wouldn't call him that to his face, she said, now at the top of the staircase, at the top of one of the many connected staircases, one of the landings, and it was a long stretched out landing that led onto a long winding corridor. There she waited Lucy, who was still a few steps behind her, to catch up. Alone, I sometimes stand here, she said, looking out now onto the vast windows, to look out on the long gardens below them, and to the rows of houses beyond that, and to the rows of rooftops far out beyond that, and the sky beyond it too. I sometimes like to just indulge him, call him Mr. Seeker, or whatever he likes to be called, later on the evening, and Mr. Porter in the day, if he's around the children. Well, I think he forbids it now, actually, she said, thinking it over, and staring down the long visitors' corridor towards where his locked and closed door was. Well, there were many other empty doors along there, but so far no other visitors yet, though there be the visiting other aunts and the other visiting uncles and grandparents, perhaps, that would stay at their intermittent planned programmed visits in the later days and weeks ahead. She stared ahead at that long corridor, thinking ahead expectantly to them also, and thinking about the old man in there, why he was there, what he was there for, and how long perhaps he would be there. Yeah, it was a silly, pretentious name he arrived with. Perhaps it was just done to have a joke or just be casual, she wondered, looking ahead to his door again. Seeking something, perhaps, though. Aren't they all, though? Asked the mother, now looking back from the long row of doorways, all closed. Looking back to Lucy, who was also stood looking out over the view, admiring the gardens, and the garden wall, and the gate, and the street, and the houses beyond that, and all the rooftop houses beyond those, the many rows of them also, looking out beyond at the views. Well, yeah, I suppose we're all looking for something or other. I guess you were looking for like a children's grandfather figure for them or something, asked Lucy now, trying to find some explanation and reason for it, and looking down also the long corridor of many doors, of all closed doors ahead, wondering if this was all a bit too much perhaps, on who all those visiting doors would entertain, and who this man that she'd entertained in the door was, not wanting to show that she had too many concerns about that though. He's a regular, said the mother. Sometimes he visits the children and me, the older children. Sometimes he'll visit a few times a week, depending on how able he'll feel. Sometimes a few weeks out of the month, a few months of the year. It does depend how often he's able to. It varies, according to his abilities, really, explained the mother. Oh, so he lives here a long time then, as a long-term thing? Asked Lucy, admiring that the long, clean wooden floorboards of the long, sleek corridor were so fresh and clean-smelling, and that it all looked so polished. It had a lovely fresh smell of flowers, too, flowers that had been placed on a nearby table, neatly in the corridors area, in the lobby area, where there was just room to stand around, admiring the long stretched out view of the windows. Before they were lining the long walls of the corridor, the tables were stood there, crammed with neat, tiny polished ornaments. Yes, he's been here quite a long time, but we don't know how long. It's like a trial visit, just to see how long things go for him. And we're reviewing it to see how it gets on. He's resting most of the time, so he really keeps himself to himself in that room. He's busy there doing his various study shows, work shows, well, a lot of family and friends shows that he's doing the video shows with, people he connects with through his video. So he's often never out of the room. You probably wouldn't see him for most of the time. Just very occasionally, the mother had said. She was looking over, studying the pretty floral wallpaper that was now lining the walls of those long corridors, studying the different floral shapes, the different patterns, noticing a few spillage marks down low near the side of the top of the stairs that hadn't been cleaned properly. Another job to do later to add to the list, perhaps. So he's resting in the room mostly, but I wouldn't be expected to care for him or to visit him or anything. Oh, no, reassured the mother, shaking her head, saying no, she wouldn't have any cleaning duties or washing up duties or any duties with him, none at all. But that she might meet him on some of her time off, in some of the resting areas of the home. "You'll have to forgive me, Lucy dear," began the older woman now. "I'm still learning to become a story or to tell a story. Sorry, I'm not really much of a story dancer or storyteller. I'm not really a narrator or anything of that sort at all. So I'm sorry if I've left things out. Anything left out, I can always fill you in later. You can always ask me about it later on too," reassured the mother. "I'm a young story dancer, nothing more than that," said the mother, with a sympathetic smile on her face, as she stood there, in front of the long stretched out windows, looking down at the gardens below, feeling that now it's getting on to late autumn. Some of those trees really wanted pruning back a little much more. She'd have to have a word with the gardeners about that too. Another job to add to the list of things to do. She was there a little breathless from all the talking, wandering around the room, the short tour, and also the entertaining. She was stood there, feeling a little older now, yet fueled on by the caffeine and a determination also to finish the story show and her narration for the visitor that she was giving the tour to. She ploughed on, announcing the name of each of the children that Lucy, the expectant childminder, would be expected to look after, and what her relation to each of them were too. And then there were the elder children too, that she mentioned very briefly, that no longer had those home care needs and were away with their other friends and family, that no longer even saw her as just the mother, not any more. She was really just friendly mum to them now. That was all. Maybe even estranged mum to some of them, a few of them, she'd admitted, just mentioning that very briefly though. To those that had chosen now to leave the family show house permanently. But most of the older children did return often to the family show house. Perhaps just occasionally, when their academic studies or when their other work, studies, permitted them to leave, and to return to visit the family show sometimes. There was only one or two, she didn't mention at length, that never chose to return to the family show house. But she never thought to mention that. And that didn't really reflect on the family show house, because they'd adopted just so many of the older children. The vast majority of those had often returned to visit when they were able to. When time and energy and resources permitted to it, many of them returned to the older guest rooms, to return to visit, to be on a family show house once more. In a reunion show, as there were often, announced the mother. But those really didn't happen that often, just quarterly or very occasionally, stressed the mother. So it really wasn't a reflection on the show family themselves, the fact that a very few of them never chose to return to the family show house. The empty rooms of those estranged children that would never return, those were then rented out to others that could then visit if they chose to. Those that were strangers themselves that could work within the family show house, and those that were just visiting friends of the family. Perhaps those rooms could be used for that, the mother had said. Yet, refusing to return, she didn't know the reasons why they didn't, and they could have their own personal reasons. She admitted she didn't know what those were sometimes, and shrugged her shoulders at that, not wanting to brood on that any more, though. And carrying on with the tour, she then began pacing along up the corridor towards one of the rooms, not regretting now having brought up those that had never returned to even visit the family show house any more. Why had she even had to visit to mention that? Why mention that at all? She regretted it. One of their rooms was now occupied by the old writer who was visiting, also called the old fantasist, or the old speculator by some. He went by different titles. The old writer, the old author, was just a quiet man who mostly just kept himself to himself, often, just engaged in writing and reading, researching, and just doing a lot of reading and listening, as well as his own writing too. He kept discreetly into his room, hardly ever know he was ever there, confided the mother to Lucy, giving him the guided tour, and stepping outside the room, saying that he was no problem, no sound, and nothing came out the room for a vast majority of the time. So it was nice having him there, really, because he was no trouble to anyone. He never really upset anyone, because he was never out the room most of the time, the majority, in fact. So he was very discreetly called the sick writer too, sometimes, because he was also quite ill and quite older, apparently. But he was only known that to her and the other sisters, a couple of the aunties, Aunt Tyrina and a few of the other aunties too, that perhaps her and the other childminders would get to know more if they decided to take on the job. He'd not minded being called the elderly writer, though he didn't like being called a sick writer, not even by her or the other aunt sisters. After watching some of the older boys calling him a sick fantasist or the sick old fantasist, no, that was a term that only a few had used, but only in a joke. They'd just done it as a casual joke a few times. When he'd watched it back on the video, it had angered and upset him just a little bit that evening, and he'd shouted something to them. She'd watched over the argument, the video of them shouting at each other, and he, himself, an older man, behaving like a child, too, being offended and having some silly, angry tantrum at them, and then being apologetic and trying to make up to it afterwards to them. She'd watched it all back and said, well, it was just something silly. And when he called them a thoughtless, mindless robot children, he was very sorry for that too. But other than that, he mostly, a majority of the time, had gotten on well with the elder children that he was in contact with and would talk with about their studies, occasionally. The studies that he wrote about that had some relevant overlapping interest with his own interested studies. Why did he call them thoughtless robots? That's a bit weird, said Lucy, the potential caretaker, who was now following the mother, going past the other doorway to the closed door of one of the visiting writers. Not sure if all of this sounded really that good at all, if she liked the sound of this person who locked themselves away so much of the time, and who'd upset a few of the older children. Well, he did apologise for that. He just felt that they weren't thinking in their response. I don't know. He's got this obsession with robotics and robotology, whatever it's called. Something about that. He said that he was obsessed by robot studies, robot theology, or whatever it was he was studying that week, and that robot was the first thing that he blurted out. He said he was all sorry in the video. You can watch it of him making up to them. I know they didn't all accept it, but they shouted bad at him too, and they have tried to make up. Some of the others call him a fantasist. Others call him the writer or the speculator. Well, maybe he was a little fanatical. She stopped outside between the two doors now, as if stopping to think about it too. He maybe was a little fanatical about some ideas, even if they weren't so awful, the ideas, confided the mother. But he did get obsessive, fanatical, just obsessive about some of the ideas. Well, he still denies the writings are pure fantasy, though, said the mother to her. I wouldn't know. I don't really know anything about the studies or what they're about. I don't have that much time to read much about it. If he is a fantasist or not, and whether it's that bad, it's never affected any of the children. And the older children, I think, were just having an angry laugh with him. Well, not angry laugh. They were laughing at him, he was laughing at them, and then they were both angry about it. But they since seem to have made up, and they don't really speak to each other much. And it's not really a big issue anyway. They don't have to see each other, and they don't really. The ones that don't get on with him. He sees a couple of them that do, but as I say, you don't really have to see him that often. And he's in his room most of the time. I don't know what he does or what he claims to study, if he does at all, really, said the mother, by way of explanation. But then, wanting to go on, she marched on then to the next door and stood outside that, awaiting for Lucy to catch up with her. The first room to actually show the visitor was actually now her potential new bedroom, her own bedroom. This was where she'd be staging if she decided to stay on in the show house with the show family. The mother danced around the little space of the room, pointing out the various cupboards, the different tables, the sink, the bed, and all the different drawers and wardrobes, and all the different empty spaces to fill things with. She pointed out the large, spacious area that could be used for all manner of things, she suggested, and the spacious area in front of the room, and showed the furniture that could be moved around and what could be adjusted, and the spacious walls that could be projected upon as well. Any number of places to have projected upon. She especially loved showing how spacious all the walls were, and all the different ornamental borders, the different frames that surrounded the different walls that could help frame the projected images. If she was into projecting, many of the visitors were, of course. And then she took her over to the small space in front of the window to show her the other views of the outside world too, pointing out clearly all the different views that were visible to her. Even though they were only empty beds, empty suitcases, empty closets, cupboards, and empty shelves, still there was a lot of space there that could be filled, and lots of room potentially for a great number of possessions and belongings, that if she had the need for any of those things to store there. The mother reassured her. This was just one of the potential rooms. If she felt she needed a larger size room, then there could be the potential to do that. But that meant swapping with some of the other long-term visitors, and that could take time to do. If it was a quick visit and she could move in soon, then this could be available immediately to her now. But in time, if she wanted to wait to work with them later on, a larger size similar room could also be available, the mother had said. She went on, pointing out the sink and the taps that worked well, and saying what time the hot water would come on and how often it would be stored for them. And she gave also some indication of the pictures on the wall, the ones that had been left behind by the previous childminding visitors, those previous childminders that had stayed in the very same room as the potential childminder Lucy was. There were the pictures of the previous childminders, that some of them had left behind their pictures that the mother could talk about. She gave a brief talk about some of the more recent ones and their stories with the children, the ones that had been close in working with the children in their studies. Even though she and the elders found them quite hard work some of the time, though. Not so much fun always to be around. She introduced one that was especially quite serious, very serious childminder, in fact, the mother had said. They called her Inspector Nanny, in fact. Her face and body and posture had all appeared very serious and strict looking, in a very formal uniform, with a grudging look about her, with almost a menacing look, but very serious and formal in her attire. Many of the children, she had got them show cleaning wonderfully well in a strict regimental routine. Well, that's why the mother had put up with some of her strict compliments that were so often. Even though she'd shown a fair judgment on many of the children's cleaning, and she got them cleaning so regular, so often, the rooms were sparkling, polished to perfection, such hygienic standards, yet nevertheless everything was so serious and so ultra serious so much of the time. It just wasn't fun to be around her all of the time. And she just couldn't talk to her so easily, so much of the time. Neither could some of the children as well. In how much of a mess they could make, though, they were not really allowed to get so many of the things out to have fun exploring with makeup or costume, or to go on great theatrical dance explorations in their show dancing or in some of their play shows. They were really controlled in how many things they could get out and how much they could do, for fear that it would make too much clutter or leave too many things around the place or take too long in the cleaning shows later that were held to such a high standard of cleanliness in the hygienic inspections that the nanny inspector had performed so often. It was just too serious to carry on with for so long, such outstandingly but just too higher expectations, although she did have her good things about her, said the mother, in gesturing towards the picture of the woman she'd referred to as Inspector Nanny. So she was just one of many of the more recent nannies that they'd had with the children. And there was another in the picture that the mother had also gestured to. She was referred to as Fairy Inspector Nana sometimes by the nanny shows and other fairy inspectors, as they were called. Probably they'd not really heard of her for a while, though. Not in a long time. She still did send some show cleaning reminders to the children every now and again, from afar. Then there was Princess Nanny. She was very extravagant in her look, full of bright, fluorescent, really abundantly colourful, flowery, floral costumes. She looked stunning, but a little costly as well. She was called Princess Nanny by some of the children, and loved greatly by some of them as well. She brought such happiness to many of them. She was so fine and elegantly courtly in her etiquette and manners. She was really had such high manners and expectation on them. She was incredible in many ways, pondered the mother, thoughtfully, thinking over her times with her. She insisted on such a regal etiquette for